Hi again, John Wesley Bready. We've reached the last chapter, chapter 18. Freedom shall live! Exclamation point. Two quotes started, Acts 22, verses 27 and 28. Then the chief captain came and said unto him, Tell me, art thou a Roman? He said, Yea. And the chief captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, But I was freeborn. And this is from the Right Honourable David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister of England around the First World War, who said this about debt, because at that time England owed America a debt of over $1 billion. Lloyd George says about that debt, I do not know the exact figures of Britain's debt to America, but I am told that it is 1,000 million odd at the present moment. It is nothing to the debt that America owes us. Right on the balance sheet, debtor, 1,090 millions. Creditor, John Wesley and George Whitefield. Bready goes on, the preceding chapters in their unabridged and unrevised form were published shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War. Warning of such approaching tragedy is contained in earlier pages of this book, for it was apparent that only a widespread spiritual awakening could have turned the world from the cataclysm that yawned ahead. Nevertheless, from the experience of this unparalleled Holocaust, and by the way, he wrote that before the Holocaust was known, this unparalleled Holocaust, historical and current issues have become more clear-cut. This stupendous conflict has been accompanied by a heartening challenge. Hope is not exterminated. The handwriting on the wall is not a death sentence to aspiration, but an assurance to faith. Beyond the valley of desolation, there looms the vision of a new heaven and a new earth, wherein peace is wedded to righteousness, and wherein erring humanity, nauseated with the sorry harvest of its own sowing, is being challenged to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Man, in recent times, by means of his own devising, has throughout vast areas all but precluded the supernal glories of him whose creative majesty made the universe and all things therein. In his subtlety, by harnessing science to do his will, he had reared a material civilization of unexampled splendor, but failing to dedicate his attainments to God, who bestowed upon him his every faculty, his civilization turned first into a Vanity Fair and then into a gilded prison house, whose dazzling contraptions expel the light of heaven, which alone can illumine his soul. Hence the recent nemesis. Absorbed in his egocentric achievements and ignoring God, man has so shorn the wings of his spirit and so dimmed the eyes of his soul that he beguiled himself into the worship of his own creations. Those creations, in turn, were transformed into military robots, assuming a power that defied his control, and so came the self-inflicted assault upon a civilization that was turning its back on God. Amidst tragedies and blackouts, however, heaven's guiding stars are again breaking through, and in their eternal light, man's soul is being challenged to a long-range perspective and a new communion with God. Even history in these days is being lifted from its humanistic hinges as events seemingly disconnected fall into correlation, while, as for tomorrow, there are harbingers of hope for a new era in world affairs. Now his subhead is A Lesson from History. Materialistic naturalism, the so-called philosophy of most modern totalitarianism, appeared first in England under the guise of Deism in Restoration times. That's about the year 1700. That philosophy, the product of a slave-trading and loose-living age, served first as a cloak for skepticism, avarice, and immorality, and later as a cause of them. In the words of Alexander Pope, it glibly prated, Thus God and nature formed the general frame, and bade self-love and social be the same. One truth is clear, whatever is right. End of the quote from Pope. By the early decades of the 18th century, this cynical naturalism had quite gained control of the intellectual life of Britain, while also it was practically dominant in her religious life, especially within the state church, that is, the Church of England, which then regarded itself as a branch of the civil service. Under the sway of this arid, soulless philosophy, England's social life sank rapidly from bad to worse, till finally, by the fourth decade of that century, that is around 1730, it reached its nadir of moral degradation. And when that nadir was reached, church and state were in the grip of a proud oligarchy who regarded the poor as outcasts, and the poor, to them, meant all the laboring multitudes of the land. By the unique labors of Wesley and the Evangelical revival, wrought in the teeth of malignant opposition, this national pestilence was conquered, and the common people of England experienced the greatest Christian renewal the modern world has known. The revival behind that renewal was nothing less than a spiritual revolution. It created a new England for the common people on old England's soil. It laid low the power of a nepotistic oligarchy and set the feet of a nation marching in confidence amidst new and jubilant strains of Christian song toward the goal of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But these words, in a revival atmosphere, had more than theoretic meaning. They were vibrant with spiritual content, and the aspirations they symbolized were founded not on mere humanism, but on a living faith. Under the impact of that revival, as a direct result of its sensitized conscience and its socialized will, came the century of the PAX Britannica, the most creative period perhaps in the annals of man. For during that century of comparative peace, through the leaven of Christian influence, there flowered the epic era of social and political reform, when Britain was transformed from a factious slave-trading aristocracy into a free, educated, and Christian democracy. While as for the British Empire, already planted on the seven seas, it, in this purged atmosphere, was peacefully evolving into a commonwealth of free peoples, each enjoying liberty of conscience and all cooperating for common ends. The classic period of American development lies within the same orbit as that of Britain. Puritanism and Evangelicalism represent the supreme spiritual forces which inspired and molded the free institutions of the United States. Both are rooted in British history, and both are inextricably associated with the struggle of the British people for liberty of conscience and freedom of government. The great Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Congregational, Protestant, Episcopal, Salvation Army, and Quaker bodies in America, moreover, were all transplanted from Britain. The largest of them was born of the Evangelical revival. The others were profoundly influenced both by Puritanism and Evangelicalism, as indeed was the very pattern of American life. Even the American War of Independence was largely an expression of this spiritual awakening. The leaders in that struggle were of British blood, but they knew well that for long reactionary forces in England had persecuted English Puritans on English soil, and now that Puritanism had been reinvigorated by the Great Revival among the common people of Britain, American leaders, confronted by the arbitrary demands of a dying oligarchy in England, sensed in these arbitrary demands an attempt to establish in America authoritarian institutions already outmoded in England. Hence, if the Revolutionary War caused the colonials to break with the government of Britain, it brought them closer to the people of Britain, most of whom sympathized heartily with the American struggle for liberty. So, yes, ironic that after the War of Independence, the American and British people together should form the greatest empire the world has ever known, the so-called Anglo-American world power. There's more to come in this chapter about the accomplishments of the Evangelical revival, this last chapter of this Freedom Whence. I'll put in a link to Walter Rauschenbusch's comment on the influence of British Puritanism upon American religion. And it's entitled, "The Church in America Still Politically Nourished by Its Puritan Roots." See you soon.